Let's have a look at some swords from Fiore de Liberi's treatise and how different types of medieval sword, particularly longswords, can actually be quite different in characteristics, with Matt Lewis as my special guest. Hey folks, Matt Easton here of Schola Gladiatoria and Matt Lewis, also known as Siege Perilous. You can check out his Instagram below here and I'll put various links. Now, we got to talking about longswords in the 15th, 14th and 15th centuries actually, but specifically we both have been and are to some degree currently practitioners of Fiore de Liberi's system. Now what's interesting about 15th century longswords is I think it's very easy to think of them all as, you know, that's a longsword. There's one type of longsword, this is what's used by Fiore or Talhoff or Palascal, whoever, and those are just longswords. But actually longswords vary a hell of a lot, don't they? And some of them are very specialized. And sometimes in order to be good at one thing, they have to become less good at something else. So we got to talking about this. So we've got a bunch of examples here to show you today, which essentially are different types of longswords that absolutely could have been found in just one treatise, just Fiore's treatise from about 1410. So, Matt, do you want to show us a sword? You've brought a bunch of swords along here. I'm holding, actually, this is one of the Windlass Royal Armourer's prototypes, so this isn't the final one, so if you notice some differences, don't worry about that. But for the purposes of this video, it works for illustrative purposes. And this is sort of a specialised sword, but we'll talk about that in a second.
We could start with some of the more sort of quintessential stuff.
Yeah.
And sort of going on your first point, I mean, I know you've been talking about armour a lot recently, and it's like, you know, in order to gain protection somewhere, you're losing mobility somewhere, there's always a compromise, and it's like that with arms and armour. And there's a chicken and the egg thing going on with arms and armour in the period as well. Like as armour progresses, you'll find that sword shapes progress and they have to compromise on what
they have to
and evolve. And it's what came first, the armour development or the weapon? And it's compromise
as well, isn't it? So and it's a question of how much you compromise. So if you are an early 15th century knight, who do you think you're going to be fighting? And that you might own 5 or 10 swords, and which sword you take out that day might be very heavily dictated by how you expect your day to pan out.
If it's peasants, you take a big wide falchion
for chopping for carving up peasants who are not going to be wearing much armour or any at all. Whereas if you know that you have to fight a duel in the barriers against another knight in full plate armour, you might choose one of the other swords, which is down here, which we'll look at in a bit.
Get to them. I think this is probably a good start, and it's classic. It's an Albion. It's a Type 15.
It's a ring-ek. It's the Albion ring-ek.
Yeah. And this kind of design and shape, it's like it's around for a long time, but
it's a compromise, isn't it? It's a compromise cut and thrust. So it's not the best cutter in the world. In fact, the Albion ring-ek, even mine's not fantastically sharpened, but even people I know that have got their pro-sharpened versions are like, yeah, it's not a great cutter.
It's not a great cutter.
But it will cut well enough. And this is something I always try to emphasise, is that sometimes it's not about trying to get something to be the best at everything. It's just like, does it do all of those things well enough?
I mean, I think we can probably agree that you still don't want to be hit.
No, I don't want to be hit by that. You know, no. Let's not do that as a test.
You know, and even if it doesn't cut so well, it's kind of smashy. I think you still break someone's collarbone.
It's got a lot of leverage to it, and it's got a relatively thin, sharp edge.
Weapon, but this is very quintessential. Size, shape, dynamics, everything. This is very, I don't know what the word
middle ground.
Yeah, middle ground.
Yeah, it's a middle ground, compromise, average, generic longsword, isn't it? Yeah, it's sort of, it's not particularly long, it's not particularly short, it's not particularly narrow, it's quite stiff, it's quite pointy, and it's got some edges on it.
Yeah, it's just very classic, very
easy to wear, which is also important. So it's not a big two-handed sword that's difficult to carry around. And this is something you could fight with in armour and half sword with it and have reasonable success with. It's not a dedicated, specialised armoured fighting sword.
It is. It's still stiff enough on that plane, and it's got a nice tip for getting in the gaps and dealing with, which is clearly what it's intended to do.
And it's also important, I think, because of the context of this particular video, it's important to emphasise for anybody who doesn't know, plate armour as worn in the late 14th and 15th centuries, you cannot cut through. Not with a sword, anyway. Maybe with some type of superpowered guillotine, you might be able to.
I can't think of anything that you can cut. You just assume you can't.
Yeah.
Just assume you're not going to cut.
So swords of this period that are at all designed to be used in armour generally have pointy points, don't they? They have narrow points, and sometimes reinforced points, but we'll look at that in a minute. But they are very much, if not completely specialised thrusting swords like maybe certain types of rapier or small sword are, they are very much leaning towards the thrusting end of the spectrum.
I mean, the way you cut down today, it's almost like a square or a flattened diamond in section.
Yeah.
It's a deliberate shape, and if you've got even some 6mm armour, you can actually... It's already into the ring, which means you don't necessarily have to burst the ring there, because if you push, you'll just push the mail along with the cut.
So hopefully these guys have seen the video that I did on Todd's channel, where we stabbed a variety of things, including mail and including steel plate, with a rondel dagger. You saw what that did. It shocked Todd and it shocked me what a rondel dagger can do. Now, a rondel dagger is a highly specialised object, and probably that's exactly what it's designed to do. But some of these swords are going in that direction as well. They do other jobs. They need to defend you. They need to deal with pole weapons. They need to, do all of these different things that a rondel dagger doesn't necessarily need to do. But nevertheless, their points owe a little bit of similarity, don't they?
Conversely, on Type 15s, actually, they all kind of look similar in 2 dimensions looking down flat, but there's a number of them in the Castillon horde which kind of look the same, totally different weights and sections. Even though it's a sort of Type 15, there's some of them are really quite thick and heavy.
Yeah.
Probably not going to have much of an edge, and they're clearly some sort of pry bar, and you'll see this as we get into the other swords. There's quite a variety of...
Yeah, do you want to just grab the mercenary for a second? So the mercenary is an interesting comparison to this. So it's another model from Albion. Actually, this isn't the mercenary. This is actually the Squire line bastard sword, but it's been upgraded, so it's very similar to the mercenary.
It does look like a mercenary.
Yeah, it's basically the mercenary. So this, you'll notice they are fundamentally really similar swords. I mean, even to the point of they've got similar guards and similar scent stopper style pommels on. But look at the blades. For a start, the mercenary is a bit shorter, but it's also considerably wider and flatter at the base.
I was going to say, this is a bit more cut.
Yeah, exactly. So
that's a bit more thrust.
So the mercenary cuts better than the ringneck, as you'd expect, because it's got a broader blade. But it's not only about the breadth; it's about the edge geometry. So I can just ask you to hold both those for a second. If you imagine your blade as it gets narrower, if it's got the same thickness at the spine, at the midrib, it means that those angles are getting more and more obtuse, and the wider that angle gets, it means even if you've got a perfectly polished edge, the gradient that the material you're cutting through is having to go up. It's essentially going up a steeper hill instead of a gradual incline. So the blade that in many ways is going to have a wider blade is going to have these multiple benefits for cutting. Not only has it got greater width behind the cutting portion of the blade, but it's also got a shallower angle.
It puts more mass behind the cut without being so wide as to create more drag. I think is kind of... That's what happens with this, is because it's quite wide. When it enters the wound tract, it's creating a lot more drag, and you're kind of having to fight the shape of the blade to get the cut. Whereas because that's thinner, because it's thinner and flatter, so you've actually got the same mass of metal there, but you've got less drag.
So you might think, why make the blade? Why is the ringneck got a narrower blade? Well, funnily enough, what I just said about the edge angles, the edge geometry, whilst that is having the narrower, essentially thicker blade, is a disadvantage for cutting, it's an advantage when you consider half swording, because that blade is now easier to grab hold of, it's less wide, and the edges are less acute. So this sword is very much less comfortable for half swording with. And if you were penetrating deeply into a target, you've also got a wider blade, which is harder to push in. So if you're stabbing into mail, aka chainmail, once you burst the first ring, if you've got a narrow blade, the blade will follow through. If you've got a wide blade, at some point you'll have to burst another ring to keep going in.
You can kind of, it's probably difficult on the camera to see, but this is the ringneck has a slightly better profile for tackling an armoured opponent, specifically, you know, trying to get into voiders and weak spots. It's just a bit better. It's
so
all more optimised.
Exactly, yeah. So basically, already with two swords that fundamentally on the surface of it can appear quite similar,
they're not.
They've got different. This is better for an unarmoured context, I would say. That one's better for an armoured context. This one is slightly shorter. It's easier to use in one hand, this sword, so you could use this on horseback a bit more conveniently.
Bastardy, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So this is what we don't 100% know that that's what they mean when they say bastard sword in period sources, but
bastard sword.
Yeah, but fundamentally they look similar, but they've actually got subtle differences. Now let's have a look at one of your swords here.
So I suppose after you've had a conversation about those two, there is somewhere you can get to, which is you're doing your best to sort of serve multiple purposes as best you can. I can't remember what type this is. It's essentially the same as a breccia, if anyone's familiar with that.
I think it's a Type 16. So first of all, who made this one?
Message Kopsiuch.
Yeah, we'll stick a link below.
I'm so sorry for murdering him. I'm so sorry.
He's a Polish swordmaker friend of ours.
Swordmaker.
Yeah, swordmaker, and he's in Poland, and we'll stick a link below to one of his pages. He's makes beautiful stuff with exquisite research. He does a very, very good level of research on original medieval swords, all of their statistics, and he also does CAD renderings of them as well, doesn't he?
He's a very talented guy.
So should we take this sword, because this is a somewhat special sword. Unlike my basic boring Albions over there, this is a special bespoke piece. Should we let's come up to the camera and have a little look at this, because this is worth a close look.
So what this does is it's doing its very best to be stiff, and you're also maintaining width for cutting. So this is somehow managing to be really quite a stiff sword, but you've still got the width for cutting, and there's quite a lot of interesting stuff going on here. So you've actually got a hexagonal section at the bottom. There's multiple facets here.
Yeah, so there's a bevel to the edge there, isn't there? Yeah. Then there's another bevel.
It's kind of it's a flattened hexagon. It's also got a flare, and it's got fuller, and then it's sort of transitioned into kind of a classic sort of Type 18
over curved silhouette.
Shape, silhouette. But you can half sword with this. It's really stiff for fighting in combat, and it can also still cut. But it's quite a hard balancing act. It is quite robust.
Can we have a look at the hilt on camera?
Let's have a look at the hilt.
That pommel, that gives me special feelings, that pommel. I love that.
It gives me special feelings too.
Where did the design looks like a church window?
I think it is a church, like a rose window or something like that.
It's amazing.
We've got some other fittings that are quite similar to this, armour and
cuffs. And I'm really a fan of this is sometimes referred to as a peen block, which is just
trying to
get the focus in. There we go. So you can see the peen is at the end there. That's the end of the tang where it's riveted, and it's got a block. It's a rivet block essentially that sits on top of the pommel. It's just so nicely made, and the subtleties of the angles on that crossguard as well are really.
It's a very classic, very quintessential in terms of size, shape. Like it's a perfect compromise, balanced long.
Although I would say worse for half swording and worse for armoured fighting than probably the two swords.
It's not as specialised for armoured fighting as, say, the ringneck.
Yeah,
but you still can.
Yeah, you absolutely can. But I would say the point, if we look at if we just come back actually a bit.
Come back.
So that's got. Whilst it's got a very acute point, it quite quickly gets quite broad. So if you were jamming that into someone's male armpit, it will snag up on the male probably quite quickly. Or maybe not.
It's very good on cloth armour. Like we've used it on some very thick gambesons, and it makes a joke of it, but it's because of the sharpened edge.
Yeah.
I think it probably fits somewhere between those two. It's possibly not quite as nimble and light and useful for unarmoured combat as, say, the mercenary is. And it's not quite as pokey and long and stabby as the Type 15, but it's just a really nice balanced design that can do it all.
Yeah,
and it's a really solid. It's a battlefield sword. I think.
Yeah,
it's got that
And it's a compromised design.
It is
now,
a compromised design.
what we'll look at next is if we go back to the windlass here. So this is modelled on an example. I've forgotten the Royal Armoury's number of, but it's based on an example in the Royal Armoury's. Now this is a absolute beast of a sword, and it's the reason I wanted to replicate it. So it's fairly heavy for its size. If I remember correctly, it's about 17 or 1800 grams. The blade is 11 millimeters thick at the base. It's 11 millimeters there. It's about 8 millimeters there, which is as thick as most other longswords are right at the base. It's still about 6 millimeters up at the center of percussion. Some swords, some medieval swords, are only 6 millimeters thick at the base of the blade. Yeah. So it's really, really stiff.
It's a bar.
It is a bar, and this, no matter how well polished you make that edge, it is never going to be a great cutter. However, I wouldn't want to be hit by it because it's going to hit you like a chisel-edged bar. Okay,
a crowbar. With the chisel edge.
But you know what? For fighting in armour, out of this sword and the other ones we've looked at, if I know I'm fighting armoured opponents, I'd actually want this sword. It's absolutely indestructible and bar-like. You know that you can clout someone in the helmet or spalder or any part of their armour, and this is not gonna lose a chunk out of the edge. It's not.
The other thing that's probably suggests that this is quite optimised for fighting in armour combat is it's got a big heavy pommel, which is it's really nice to have, isn't it? In that context, we can just be able to.
Well, whether you're using it like the Mortschlag or whether you're actually just using it as a striking implement, you know, because a lot of techniques you're using the pommel just gripping the sword normally. But of course, also if you're half swording, then yes, most of the time you might be stabbing with that end, but when you're not, you're clouting with this end. It's a hammer. It's like having a hammerhead on the back end of the sword.
It's useful.
So, and also in terms of half swording, it's so stiff that it means if you're pushing in or you're levering, imagine you've got that around someone's helmet and you're trying to throw them over your knee, or you're trying to put them in an arm lock, if you've got that under their elbow and then around the back of the shoulder, or you're just stabbing with it, it gives so much support having that stiffness to the blade. So honestly, despite the fact that, you know, these are beautiful swords and those are much better in certain contexts, for fighting in armour, I would choose this sword out of those four every single time, because I know that it wouldn't hardly bend at all, you know, hardly flex at all. It's not going to bend or break. It's very solid, and it gives you the maximum thrusting and striking potential for half swording. And also, frankly, it's more pleasant to grip because it's got such a thick blade and such a sort of obtuse edge geometry that it is actually nicer to half sword with.
Yeah, and these are all contemporary to the Fiore manuscripts. They fit within his lifetime. And this is what, 1380?
Yeah, it's late 1300s. So I mean, any one of these swords that we've just looked at, despite the fact that there's differences of style of the blade and differences of you know, aesthetic detailing of the hilts, any of these could have been in Fiore's treatise, couldn't they?
Yeah, and even some of them kind of look like. I mean, we've got the drawings and the getty and so on, but frankly, like they could all appear in the manuscripts, really.
Absolutely, yeah.
And they probably do to some extent. Talking of things that appear in manuscripts.
Yeah, well, so so leading on from this, so if I regard this as a specialised armoured knight's fighting sword, and despite the fact it looks like a normal sword, and to most people on screen or in a book, a picture in a book, it just looks like a long sword like the others, and you might not realise how specialised it is until you pick the thing up and handle it and flex it, and then you're like, okay, this is specialised. So something can look like a normal sword but be specialised in one direction or the other.
You'd be within your rights to think that might be quite similar to the ringette.
Yeah, but it's not. It's not at all, no. Now, we're going to look at a sword which is also specialised, but you can see it specialised from the minute you see it. So it's almost like this sword taken to its natural evolutionary conclusion.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a battlefield item, and I think perhaps what we're going to show you is it's kind of bending the rules of armoured duels, fighting with a sword.
Yes, it's probably for duel more than battlefield.
I barely even consider this a sword.
Go on.
Okay,
whip it out. Let's have a look. Let's have a look.
Oh. So we've got the...
it's just magnificent.
Mr. Shanky Stab.
Is that the official name, Mr. Shanky Stab?
It is now.
Okay.
So where do we begin with this? So
tell us its features.
Its features. Fiore talks about this in the manuscript. I'm sure we can like get an image and some of the description on it. But this is as described. The process of reproducing this was difficult because there are no survivals, and we kind of had to.
Who made this?
This is Jan at Elgur.
Oh, right.
Frankly, it's very good.
Sword Elgur. Yeah.
Sword maker Elgur, and this is really good. Like the fit and finish and everything on this.
It's very
crisp,
isn't it?
and clean. Yeah, really, really good. I won't bore you too much with the process of reproducing this, but we had to look at some sort of later stuff from like Vienna and other types of S stock that was as close to kind of frog DNA and fill in the gaps. But I'm quite happy that this is functional. Yeah, sure. Please do. So you've got a heavy pommel with an end for striking.
So funnily enough, although that pommel is pointy, you do actually get pommels like that on Castillon swords. There's a couple of swords. So it's actually, if we just grab the ring for a second, it's almost like you got a standard scent stopper pommel. And there have been people that have surmised this, that someone at some point had a normal scent stopper pommel and went, I wonder what it would look like if we put that on backwards. So it's funny because it is exactly like a scent stopper pommel, but just flipped around the other way. But that being said, that makes it far more offensive for smacking into people.
He does describe them as pointed, and I think I just tried to sort of steer in. We'll use stuff that we know it exists, we know these pommels exist, we know it's a type of pommel, it kind of fits the period and stuff, so we'll use that. It might not necessarily be what it meant, but where possible, trying to use actual extant stuff that fits. So it is a bit conjectural. Likewise, the crossguard is also specialised for armoured combat.
Pointy.
It was very pointy. It's also hardened and tempered.
Oh, that is hardened. Okay.
As well.
Which I think Vadi talks about.
I think Vadi does. Yeah. So I did refer to Vadi's book and had a look at what he was doing as well with his, just to
Vadi has a very similar looking one, doesn't he?
Vadi's only a little bit later, and you can kind of see how this would progress into what you see in Vadi's thing. Also, So Fiore actually states, or at least in the translation I wrote, that this whole thing should be sharp, which is quite odd for a specialised foot combat sword. Like personally, I would probably only sharpen the end, but that's something he specifies for one of the more bonkers. So there's a more bonkers one than this in the manuscript, which I just didn't want to try and attempt, to be honest. But you've also got this cutout in the middle, and these come up more and more and more. I think this is the first time I think you see it. Perhaps is
it's the earliest documented one,
depiction of it. But later on, there's ones in Vienna with this. I think you see it in
it's in Talhofer
and some other things.
So there's a similar-ish and related sword in the so-called Codex Wallenstein as well, which is that part of it is fairly early 15th century. But this, it's interesting that this looks like the Fiore version and the Vadi version arguably as well. And the surviving sword in Vienna, which is there to go and study in the cabinet, is very like this. This is very heavily.
There's one in Vienna, and there's one other one that's a bit later that also there's a few that have this cut. This cutout thing is a feature of this kind of specialised sword.
And of course, it is for half swording. Yeah,
it is. Yeah.
So like I said with that other sword's very, very well set up for half swording, but this is like taking it even further to the whole, so it is all of the things that you do in half swording, this sword is specialised for it. It's got a special, nice, comfortable place to grip.
I mean, you call it a sword, but to me, it's more like a short spear / pot. It's like a spear pilot, but you don't really use it like a sword.
No, and that guard could be used to strike within a number of ways, of course.
You can strike and hook.
Yeah.
You can punch that into someone's
potentially
neck.
If you were holding the sword the other way around, which I'm not going to do, then you could.
Not, no,
yeah.
Cut your hand.
It's fairly sharp. But you could strike with that, and obviously striking with the pommel in all the ways.
It's all weapon. The whole thing is a weapon. It's extremely specialised.
However,
singular.
Probably for a duel.
I think so.
So one of the problems of this type of sword is it might not easily go into a scabbard. You need a particular type of scabbard to accommodate this blade. I would say quite a wide hole, wouldn't you?
A big dagger scabbard than an actual sword scabbard. I've thought about making one.
Right, okay.
I haven't got to it yet.
And equally, if you were wearing this around as a sidearm, and if your principal weapon was a lance or a poleaxe or whatever, that might not be the nicest. If you're in armour, it might not matter, but overall, I wouldn't particularally want a pointed crossguard.
It's kind of a feature of armoured combat stuff. Is like you can get away with these extra spikes things, and you'll find that on, you know, with the pedale on a
because you're not having to live with the sword. You're not having to wear the sword around. You literally just turn up to fight the duel, and you get given your weapons.
But
so
yeah, if you're not wearing armour, you do stand a risk of hooking yourself or someone else,
or your horse,
or like
really annoying your horse.
And it's not something you take on campaign or to battle subsequent. I mean, it'd be kind of useful in the battle, but to be honest, as specialised as this is, if you're going into battle, you'd just take a poleaxe, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
And the poleaxe is even better.
And the sword that you choose in that situation, because it's a backup weapon, you might choose a different type of sword because it might be a sword actually for attacking people with less armour because they're more numerous on the battlefield.
I've always felt it's kind of like it's almost like we're going to have a duel with swords, and it's like, yes, a sword.
Oh, a sword. Yes, I'll bring something that will look like a sword.
Turns up to a sword duel with that, and the other guy's just got a type 15.
Yeah, it's like, what the? You said a sword. This is a sword. Yeah. Anyway, that's a fantastic thing. So, to sum up, I think hopefully by watching this video, you can see that even in one particular point of time, in one particular place, if we just limit it to 1410 in Italy, you can actually have a bunch of longswords that have really quite tangibly, materially different characteristics and will be good at some things, mediocre at some things, and might be really bad at certain other things. And some swords were extremely specialised already by this point, while others were a kind of jack of all trades.
Yeah.
Anyway, thanks a lot to Matt for joining me. Check out the links below, and you'll be seeing some more of us in the very near future. Thanks for watching. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.